With the betting line creeping toward Texas A&M, why is Missouri getting no respect? Let's talk about it right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. On today's program, I want to talk about the old Mizzou mentality. No, not old like Ole Miss, but the old Missouri mentality that really needs to be left in the past by a lot of Missouri fans. Before I start the program, I do want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. And apologies to you every dayers out there, but I'm going to be slightly repetitive here at the very top of the show. The difference between the point spread right now over at FanDuel Sportsbook, Texas A&M being a 2.5-point favorite, very unusual for the S&P Plus projections over at ESPN. Missouri guy Bill Conley does those projections for those of you who are not in the know there. But for Missouri to be a 5-point favorite on those projections, usually those two things follow pretty closely. So a 7.5-point difference, that's really significant there. So what is it about Texas A&M? Is it mostly public perception here that explains the difference? Well, it's my opinion that I think that is what explains it. I'm not really sure what else could, because I think most people, many college football fans this past Saturday, watched Arkansas get beaten down the stretch there by a very good Texas A&M, impressive Texas A&M front seven for sure, that's shut down the high variance Hogs with just 3 points in the second half in Dallas. But really, I think that recency bias aside, of course, Missouri didn't play last week, so maybe that comes into play a tiny bit as well. But I think it's quite obvious. I think the Tigers' most two recent results are causing the public perception to be that, well, maybe this Missouri team isn't quite as good as what they think we are. And I think that's fair. I really do. If I were on the outside looking in and hadn't watched Missouri particularly closely the first 4 weeks, I would have my skepticism as well. But as somebody who looks more deeply into Missouri's the entire picture and Missouri's opponent other than just simply the results, well, what I'll say is, as somebody who's been emphasizing the need to get back to a more simplified football analysis these days, let's take a quick look again at the two most important factors, I believe, the two most important people, at least, in football on any team. That'd be the quarterback and the head coach. Well, I think Marcel Reed is going to be your starter once again, and no matter what you think about Brady Cook this season, I think it'd be rather controversial for anybody to say that, oh yeah, I'll take Marcel Reed over Brady Cook. And just in general, the Texas A&M passing game against the Missouri passing game, I just don't think there's much of a comparison there. I think Missouri has a pretty clear advantage, despite whatever nitpicks and complaints we have about the deep passing game as Missouri fans so far. And number two, the head coach. Listen, I think Mike Elko is a very good coach. I think he's a good shot at being successful in College Station, but the reality is he's approximately a fourth of the way through his first season in College Station. Even in the transfer portal era, with a whole bunch of new veteran players that you can bring in, guys like Nick Scorton, by the way, who's been tremendous for the Aggies, basically sealed the game for them against Arkansas last week. Well, despite all of that, it's tough to not only establish a culture, but establish a culture with a whole bunch of new guys in the locker room, and you're doing it with a backup quarterback. And a fairly capable backup quarterback is Marcel Reed. I just frankly think Brady Cook is better. And then back to the coaching point. Again, I can praise Mike Elko all I want. He's still extremely early in the process here, whereas Eli Drinkwitz is in year 5. He's already gone through an entire cycle of players from freshman to graduation. He's already had his breakout season of 2023. I just think, and this Missouri team, by the way, they have a something to prove type of mentality. Well, if they really have that, this is the week they need to prove something. They've had a bye week. They have UMass next week. This is not a trap situation. In fact, this is kind of the perfect spot if you're traditionally a better looking for a good spot for a team that has an important game coming in. If it'd be one thing if Alabama was next week following Texas A&M. I could see how you'd be going, well, maybe this will be a slight trap game, maybe not the best spot in the world, whatever you're saying. I think this is the perfect spot for Missouri. So for all of those reasons, I'm definitely leaning towards the Tigers plus 2.5, and even more so on the money line at plus 110 over at FanDuel. And by the way, earlier in the week, I did compare this Texas A&M game to the Kansas State game last year with just, it really felt like a fulcrum game for the whole Tigers season. And just by the way, in case you are wondering, if you think I am the biggest homer on earth, remember back to the Kansas State game last season, I did pick the Tigers to cover the spread in that game, but I did pick the Wildcats to win. So it's not as though I'm picking Missouri every single week, no matter what. For some reason, and I forget about the Kansas State game last year, that's old news, but I just feel more confident about Missouri's chances this week going in to College Station than I did against the Wildcats, even at home last season. Now, I will say one real concern beyond obviously what is a very strong Texas A&M defensive front is it is Missouri's first game on the road. Obviously, Kyle Field, not an easy place to play, maybe a little bit overrated in terms of the hardest places to play in the entire country. We can debate that, but it's going to be a challenge for Missouri in terms of handling that crowd noise. And also, more specifically from my vantage point, I am curious to see how Missouri handles the new quarterback communication in the helmet in College Station. In theory, this should make it easier to communicate. In reality, I don't know. I'm just curious to see how it goes down for the Tigers. So that is something that makes me a little bit nervous here. But ultimately, I come back to, yes, Texas A&M has some very good players on their team, no doubt about it. But I just feel more comfortable with our quarterback than their quarterback. I think our program is more established than Texas A&M at this point. And simply put, hey, the Missouri defensive front is pretty doggone good as well. Christian Williams, Chris McClellan, Zion Young, Johnny Walker. Heck, Joe Moore had a big play last week against Vanderbilt. Missouri's been rotating a lot of guys in and out, and effectively so, but especially, man, that four up front unit that first string unit there that I just listed off has been, all four of them have been very impressive to my eyes. So the Missouri defensive front, nothing to turn your nose up at either. And I think Marcel Reed is going to have his own challenges to deal with as well. And a quick injury update here as Eli Drinkwitz revealed that Marquis Johnson did not practice yesterday for the Tigers, and it didn't sound very optimistic from Drinkwitz's perspective that Johnson was going to play. He was saying, well, we'll see what happens, that kind of deal. But to me, it just doesn't seem very likely, especially if he's not even practicing in a limited fashion at this point in the week. So look for Marquis Johnson, the Texas native, unfortunately, to not be able to play at Kyle Field on Saturday. But you know what? Speaking of a guy who hasn't played a whole lot to start the season, I talked about Williams Nwaneri a little bit ago and how a few fans have been worried that, oh my goodness, if he's not going to play already, well, is he going to be unhappy here? That type of deal. Well, this brought up to me, I think, some old feelings that Missouri has from somewhat recent history. Maybe they remember when Mekhi Wingo and Dominic Lovett transferred to other programs within the SEC, LSU and Georgia, of course, respectively. Well, I think to me that's an old Missouri mentality that we need to leave in the past, and I'll explain why coming up here in just a second. But first, let's talk about Gametime, because This time of year, you've got football, heck, you've got playoff baseball, so many great live events, and even fall concerts as well. Well, Gametime is the absolute best place to get your last-minute tickets, and it's the simplest place and cheapest place as well. And Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting your tickets to your favorite events even easier. You can queue up, for example, hey, you want to go to Monday Night Football, see the Chiefs take on the New Orleans Saints? Well, it's not going to be cheap. I can promise you that. Tickets are quite expensive, but you're going to save the most money possible with Gametime. Again, toggle the Gametime picks so you'll narrow it down to only the best deals possible. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. So I bring up Williams Nwaneri, or I have brought him up a couple times in the past couple weeks, because I think somewhat understandably, at least on the surface, Missouri fans start getting nervous when a big-time five-star, possible number one recruit in the nation type of player isn't really getting any playing time early in the season. In the offseason, I thought, heck, obvious passing downs, maybe they'll shift Nwaneri in there and get him some action. I really thought that was more likely than not. But to be honest, the Missouri front seven right now, especially the defensive ends, well, there's 4 or 5 guys who are playing good football right now ahead of Nwaneri, and guys who have a lot of experience, by the way, in college football for the most part. Major college football as well. Guys who have been brought in from the portal on the outside like Zion Young, and even guys on the inside like Chris McClellan this season who have been really, really productive players. And that's the thing. That's the thing about, it's really not even about Nwaneri, who I'm not particularly worried about, because number one, Missouri's name, image, and likeness infrastructure, by all accounts, is incredibly competitive. So Williams Nwaneri, again, like I said about Brady Cook the other day, I don't know what Williams Nwaneri's making, but he's doing okay. I think he's doing just fine for an 18-year-old guy, that's for sure, especially compared to the 18-year-olds of yesteryear of college football. But here's the thing, if you don't get that money if you transfer somewhere else, and certainly this is not the moment in time to cash in on Williams Nwaneri's value. And more to the point here, when is the last time Missouri actually lost somebody in the portal that they really wanted? I brought up Mekhi Wingo and Dominic Lovett. Those are the two, in my opinion. Since Lovett, who's it been? Honestly, since the Dominic Lovett transfer of the 2022 offseason, who's Missouri lost? An important player that they really wanted to keep, either for the 2023 or 2024 seasons. I genuinely can't think of a single person, but I can think of a lot of guys that Missouri has brought in, guys like Tyron Hopper and guys this year, again, McClellan, Zion Young, tons of guys who have been important parts of this defense. Toriano Pride, important parts of this defense. Theo Weiss last season, big parts of this team that have been very productive players. Missouri's done quite well, and not only, I think, finding the right players for the roster, but melding them into the culture of the locker room as well. So, and yet, I just can't think of a whole lot of disgruntled players that were like, oh, I'm getting out of here. Even in the case of Mekhi Wingo, well, I believe he ended up following a coach that was very close to him, maybe even a high school, position coach, something like that. Apologies for not having the exact details there. But I do believe he transferred to LSU mostly to follow a coach that he was very close to, had a good relationship with. Dominic Lovett, by all accounts, was a guy who wanted to play at Georgia coming out of high school. Didn't end up getting offered there. Saw an opportunity to go to the school that he always wanted to go to, and, well, that was that. But yeah, again, I just can't think of any examples of that in the past 2 years. So the fact that Missouri does have the ball rolling in terms of, hey, playing good football, Tigers were 11-2 last season, off to a 4-0 start this season, likely to go at least 9-3 or so. So you're talking 20-plus wins in 2 seasons, plus the competitive NIL infrastructure and creative NIL structure, I would say, too. Forward-looking, all that good stuff. Hey, who knows what college football in Missouri specifically is going to look like in 5 to 10 years. But for the present, let's live in the present. And in the present, Missouri is a destination and not a place that anybody's looking to flee. The recent history just paints that picture quite clearly. Now, obviously, a lot of Missouri fans would like to see the Missouri deep passing game start clicking a little bit better, and it's quite possible that the whole team is starting to feel some of that pressure as well. Eli Drinkwitz basically said that Missouri's desire to get that deep passing game going has caused Brady Cook and, to some extent, the rest of the team to maybe push a little bit too hard for those opportunities when, in fact, they may not be there. And really the talk of the NFL the last couple seasons, especially in 2023, was cover 2 defense, basically 2 safeties deep anyway, against Patrick Mahomes in particular. And now this season, really, to my eyes, and I haven't watched the NFL quite as closely so far as I have been with college for a whole bunch of reasons, but I'm watching the Chiefs as closely as always, and it sure seems like everyone is still very content to play 2 safeties deep and keep everything in front of you, at least until you get into the red zone type of area and the field shrinks a little bit. Sounds pretty familiar for those of us who were Gary Pinkel fans for all of those years. That's a pretty similar style of defense to what you saw from Missouri for all those years, sort of the bend but don't break style, whether it's cover 2 or whatever. There's no doubt about the state of the NFL passing game right now. So my point in bringing all of this up is that it's not just Missouri that is struggling somewhat to hit the deep pass, despite why everybody saw a lot of fireworks in the Alabama and Georgia game in terms of explosive plays. That hasn't necessarily been the norm. And for Georgia themselves, well, they've had some trouble getting the passing game going against Kentucky in particular. But, of course, the NFL is a copycat league. Well, college football is, of course, as well. And NFL types and NFL strategies that are successful at that level are going to trickle down, just like successful college offenses, for example. Those type of concepts have trickled up into the NFL as well. So I just thought Derek Thompson, who's writes at The Ringer and is also with The Athletic as well, he says on the state of the NFL passing game through 4 weeks, these are his stats, this is the highest completion rate ever in league history for the quarterbacks, and yet also the lowest average yards per catch ever. So it's been dink and dunk city. If you think Missouri and Kirby Moore have been throwing a lot of short passes, my point is this has been an extreme trend league-wide in the NFL right now too. Also the fewest interceptions per game ever as well, and yet the highest sack rate in 32 years. Also the fewest passing yards per game overall in the league in 21 years. So thank goodness for Jaden Daniels, who's made the league pretty exciting the first few weeks, but to be honest, a lot of boring football so far, to be honest, in pro football from what I've seen. So my point in bringing all this up, again, I understand that Missouri fans are mostly focused on Missouri, and that's what this show is focused on as well. But I think context is always so incredibly important, and you're just seeing the trend right now. We can argue about what the reasons are, but defenses are just effectively taking away the deep ball, especially between the 20s right now. They're taking away explosive plays at a rate higher than they ever have before, and right now offensive coordinators seem content to just take the 5, 10, 8-yard type of passes and try to slowly but surely move the chains. That's something we've seen from Missouri so far this year too, and that's all well and good, but they've got to obviously get better at cashing in with touchdowns instead of field goal attempts. And as all of you everydayers are well aware at this point, I'm very much expecting Marcel Reed to be the starting quarterback for Texas A&M this week. But what about Eli Drinkwitz? Is he buying the game time decision tag for Connor Wigman? Let's find out here in just a second. But first, let's talk FanDuel, because NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch during the middle of a ball game, you can check out the latest stats, view play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That is FanDuel.com. And again, you know what I like this week? It's the Tigers. Plus 2.5, plus 110 on the money line, and even the under at 48.5 I think is pretty tasty as well. So choose one of those three. You're bound to be right on one of them, right? So go to FanDuel.com. And like myself, Eli Drinkwitz does not seem to be buying the game time decision talk for Texas A&M's Connor Wigman. He hurt his AC joint in his shoulder early in the season in week 2, I believe, against their FCS opponent. And he has not returned since. 3 straight starts for Marcel Reed. And also specifically on he's listed as a first stringer in the depth chart. Eli Drinkwitz, no stranger to fake depth charts. He was calling that semantics. But also Drinkwitz on his radio show at Bud's Barbecue talking about Nate Noel. I thought this was an interesting thing to say. He said Noel can read the outside zone as good as anybody that I've coached. Well, Nicolas Cage would call that high praise. And indeed, that is very high praise when you consider Cody Schrader was just here, and I thought he read the outside zone as about as good as anybody possibly could have, especially when you go back and watch the cuts and the decisions that he made. That is really, really high praise for Nate Noel. And indeed, in the offseason, I pointed out that while I liked Marcus Carroll as a player too, there was no doubt that Noel came from a much more similar run scheme at Eli Drinkwitz's old stomping grounds of Appalachian State. So not a huge surprise here that he's taken the reins, but I think Marcus Carroll obviously still an important part of the short yardage game. And really, in my opinion, I'd like to see Missouri in those 3rd and 1, 4th and 1 type of situations, especially in the red zone near the goal line where more and more defenders are going to be near the football in line of scrimmage. I'd like to see them maybe get a little bit more downhill more quickly, even some man blocking on occasion in special circumstances. Just simple it up a little bit. And by the way, Marcus Carroll, more of the downhill type of runner. I think that's maybe a slight change there that Missouri should consider here in the future. Now, another thing that Missouri needs to clean up, obviously, is penalties, and Missouri has been penalized probably too often under Eli Drinkwitz, but I do like to look, again, as all of you know, I love looking at the big trends, and one trend you notice from the NFL is that offensive penalties, well, if you commit offensive penalties at a higher rate than average, that's going to affect your chance at victory in a negative fashion. But yet, defensive penalties, in fact, this is in the aggregate, there is no correlation between defensive penalties and winning. I'm going to say that again because people aren't going to believe this, but it's statistically true. In the NFL, and by proxy, you got to think in college football too, the rules aren't that different. There is no correlation between defensive penalties and winning. Now, how can that possibly be? Because obviously there are moments where a defensive penalty can keep a drive alive, maybe put the ball on the 1-yard line in the NFL a lot of times on a 35-yard pass interference or something like that. So really, in the NFL, defensive penalties should be more impactful in the game. And yet, overall, again, this is all in the aggregate, it seems to have no real correlation with winning. Again, 1 play, 2 plays here or there, sure. there's no doubt that there are moments when defensive penalties can cost you the game. The part that people aren't looking at, though, is all the defensive penalties that you get away with. Kansas City Chiefs fans and observers are going, yes, now I'm starting to get it. All the times where the NFL is rigging the game for Kansas City. I'm joking, people. But seriously, there is no doubt that on occasion, there are moments where, hey, there are defensive penalties that seem like, it seemed like the defensive back or the safety got there early. They don't call it. There may have been some hand fighting down the field, no flag, that type of thing. Well, it's hard to calculate all of that here was the non-calls and put that into a box score. No, the actual penalties that are called fit much more neatly into a box score, but that is why defensive penalties, again, in the aggregate, don't really have a correlation on winning. So it's always my thing. It's not so much offense-defense penalties. I just want to see Missouri clean up penalties that they can easily control, that aren't judgment calls for the most part by officials. Things like holding and pass interference. I'm talking more about procedure penalties, false starts, having to waste a timeout to avoid a delay of game even. That kind of thing that doesn't show up in the penalty box score, but is a procedural error nonetheless. So if Missouri, to me, cleans up the mental mistakes as far as penalty goes, I'm not going to be too worried about their penalties of aggression. For years and years and years, the Oakland Raiders would seemingly lead the league in penalties back in the 80s and 90s, and yet the Raiders were still very good during that period. As Lisa Simpson said back in the day, I'm picking the Raiders because they always cheat. Well, and cheat and win they did during that time. So if the Tigers want to keep cheating, I'm okay with it. Let's just stop making the mental errors that lead to easy lost yardage. That's my point. So, with all that being said, thanks for joining me here on the podcast. If you want somebody who isn't going to be, advocating for cheating, maybe somebody with an actual moral compass, unlike myself, well, you got to check out Spencer McLaughlin. He's going to get you ready for everything happening this week in college football and the rest of the season. Find Locked On College Football on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So until next time, I am John Miller, and this has been Locked on Mizzou.